Good evening, Mr. Goldberg. Good evening from JRoots. Yom Hashoah 2021. It's a privilege to welcome Mr. Goldberg, a survivor who was born in Germany and endured concentration camps and the infamous Death March. Managed to get to England, to London, and rebuild his life over here in an incredible manner. Thank you very much, Mr. Goldberg, for joining us. It really is a privilege and an honor for us all. Maybe we could start by you sharing with us where you were born, what type of a family you grew up in.
I was born in a town called Kassel in Germany in 1930. Both my parents were born in Poland. Both of them came to Germany as singles. They met in Germany through a shadchan, a matchmaker, and married in 1927, settled in Germany. And as I said, I was born in 1930 and the younger brother in 1934. My father had spent years in yeshiva as a youngster, and we were a strictly Orthodox family. In our town in Kassel, there were really two distinct Jewish communities, the German-born and the Polish immigrants, who were known as the Ostjuden. They were not liked by the German Jews because they were too visibly Jewish. Many of the German-born Jews of the larger section of the community were quite assimilated. So the Jewish Polish immigrants began forming their own sort of Stiebler, small synagogues, which they began attending. I recall walking with my father to shul on a Shabbos morning, holding his hand into really more of a stiebel than a synagogue. It was an informal synagogue, which of course adhered to strictly Jewish rites, unlike some of the German synagogues. There was a large German synagogue close to where we lived, where they played the organ on a Friday night. And of course, that was totally out of bounds to any Orthodox Jew. But of course, the Nazis didn't differentiate. On 9th of November, Kristallnacht, 1938, that Reform synagogue was set on fire and demolished, vandalized, just like every other synagogue. Hundreds of them on that day.
Can you, Mr. Goldberg, were you a witness to Kristallnacht in Kassel, in your hometown?
Yes, we were in Kassel. We could get a limited view of what was going on. It was not safe for any Jew to be out in the street. I was only a little boy. I was 8 years old at the time. But I do recall sort of looking through the window and being quite terrorized by what we saw. It was self-evidently led by the military. When the Nazis gained power, that they formed two elite groups. The black-shirted ones were the SS, who were later in charge of all the hundreds of camps. And there was a second sort of division who wore brown shirts. They were the sort of bully boys for the Nazis, that they sort of silenced any opposition, if necessary, but by physical force, of course. And it was mainly the brown shirts who were roaming around the streets, firing up the population to follow them and attack any Jew they saw in the street, in any Jewish business that was known as Jewish. Most of them were, of course, had Jew painted on the shop window, and on that night, most of them were completely vandalized. They would break the shop window, enter the shop, loot it empty, and if it happens to be larger place which stood in its own ground, then it was usually set on fire.
And did you witness this? Did you see your synagogue on fire?
I saw not our synagogue was a small place, but the one I've described to you, which used the organ, that I could see flames and smokes rising from. That was quite close to us, about 3 minutes walk. And it was a very substantial building. I could see it sort of on the evidence that it was on fire.
And what as a Jew, as an Orthodox Jew, and understanding that that the Jewish community was being targeted merely by the fact that you were Jewish, as a young boy of 8 and then 9 and 10, what message did your parents or your teachers give to you? What was going through your mind when you were enduring such hardship and such persecution?
My parents, like every other Jew in Germany, were desperately attempting to leave, but there was just nowhere to run. Most countries have tightly shut borders. A few of them had annual visa quotas, but they imposed such stringent conditions that it was extraordinarily difficult to obtain one of these life-saving visas. I'm not sure whether you know, but around Kristallnacht, around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Well, my father was not one of those arrested. The reason being that we lived in an apartment block. There were 6 apartments in our block, and 2 were occupied by Jewish people. The rest were non-Jewish German families. And one of these families was a family, I remember the name to this day, Dilling. And Mr. Dilling was a German policeman, a non-Jewish German policeman. He was not a Nazi, and we had a sort of a nice friendly relationship with him. And days before Kristallnacht, he rang our doorbell. So I'm told, I didn't witness this, but my father later, or Sholem, told me that he whispered to my father that he couldn't go into any details, but it would be in my father's interest to disappear for 2 or 3 weeks. Well, my father took the hint. I don't know where he went, but he went into hiding. And sure enough, these brown-shirted fellows rang our doorbell. And when we said my father was not in, they wouldn't believe us. They came into the apartment, searched it thoroughly, and of course went away, realizing he was not there.
And Mr. Dilling was a German policeman?
A German policeman, yes, just a standard policeman. Did
you come across him again?
Well, the last time I saw him, and I remember this, was quite extraordinary. One day, late in 1941, there was a ring on our doorbell, and 2 of those brown-shirted SA men entered our apartment, told my mother she had 10 minutes to pack a suitcase, and then we had to accompany them, and they advised her to pack some food and drink. We went away with them, and as we left the front of our building, there was Mr. Dilling, the policeman, standing there, and my mother, Olea Sholem, handed Mr. Dilling the key to our apartment and said, "Mr. Dilling, will you please be good enough to keep an eye on our apartment until we return?" Little did we know. This was in 1941. Then we spent almost 4 years in various camps till by a miracle we were liberated. That's Mr. Dilling ended up with the key to our apartment.
So Mr. Dilling, the German policeman, a name that your family and I guess many other people will remember forever. Maybe that brings up the question that many people ask survivors about good Germans, not good Germans? Is anti-Semitism endemic? Does everybody hate the Jews, or they're good people and bad people? What's your opinion?
Well, there are, without any doubt, I will cite you an example if you can spare the time, if you can listen to me. Just about 2 months ago, I received a message from the Holocaust Educational Trust. Excuse me, forgive me, I must turn this off. So sorry.
I should also, Mr. Goldberg, whilst you're turning your phone off, take this opportunity to wish you happy birthday. I think you have a birthday this month, don't you?
I have indeed, yes.
Are we past, or are we ahead of time?
No, we're almost there.
Almost there.
Yes.
Are we allowed to ask which year we'll be celebrating?
My birthday is on the 21st.
21st of April. How old will you be?
Mirza Hashem, 91.
Amazing. Wonderful. Wonderful. It's a good chapter of Psalms, a good Kapitel Tehillim.
Yeah.
Aleph. Hashem should look after you forever. And please God, you'll be able to celebrate with the family many more birthdays.
I'll tell you something which I remember to this day. In Germany, on my birthday, the flags were always out because Hitler's birthday was on the 20th of April, and the flags were still flying on the 21st.
I guess since we're talking, since we're talking about birthdays, somebody like you who lost so much and amongst the survivor population, I guess a birthday is something very special. When as you pass the milestones of life, what's the feeling of a survivor such as yourself? You went through places of death and so many people losing life, around you. What does a birthday mean to you?
Well, in the camps, incidentally, some time ago, I sat down and calculated that I spent 1,234 days in the camps. 1, 2, 3, 4. And every single day was a lottery. And if you were still alive that the evening of that day, you'd won the lottery. And I don't know if I should say lahavdil or not, but in post-Holocaust life, every day is a gift from the Almighty.
Sure. I know there's the lahavdil, there's another survivor who I'm sure you knew, Mr. Goldberg, another Mr. Goldberg, who is Bertie Goldberg, who was born in Auschwitz and lost many of his family, but he managed to get to England. He also would always say that every day is a birthday. But I think I find this is something that's people such as my generation and our children's generation, it's something that we can very much learn from people like you, and an appreciation of life. And certainly speaking to you over the past few months during this period of Corona, your appreciation of every day, and being able to just carry on with life, even despite the hardships. It's something that we all have much to learn from people such as yourself. I was asking you about I get the question about good Germans, bad Germans, good people, bad. Do human beings have the capacity to choose?
I'll give you one small example. As I said, I'll just keep it very brief. I had a phone call from the Holocaust Educational Trust telling me that a German lady had contacted them. She had come across my testimony, and from it was clear that I was liberated in a town called Neustadt. And she said she lives in Neustadt, and they have had for decades, at least 25 years or so, a group of local Germans who are attempting to find out the names of people who were guilty. That our death march, part of our death march was being loaded onto barges and being towed to sea. I will not go into any detail, but I can tell you that our barge eventually run aground some distance outside Neustadt, and those who still had the will to live and had the strength to clamber up onto deck and jump into the water and make their way onto land did so. Eventually, we were rounded up by the Germans, by the Nazi guards again, and made to march into Neustadt. But the second of our barges run aground actually in the port of Neustadt, and about 300 captives from the barge clambered off, made their way into the town of Neustadt. They got ashore, and I mean, as we got ashore also, we didn't know which way to run. It was nighttime, pitch dark. Do we run left for safety? Right? Do we stay where we are? We didn't know. And likewise, these from the other barge who got off and entered the town of Neustadt were not as fortunate in the sense that as we were. They were attacked by SS men, by German police, and extraordinarily, quite a number of civilians actually joined in. And they murdered around 250 people on the 3rd of May.
When was this, in May, April or May?
On the 3rd of May, the day Neustadt was captured by the British. Several hours after this happened, the British troops liberated Neustadt. This happened hours before the Allies reached Neustadt. And this German committee have been attempting to find out the names of the civilians who participated. And she tells me, despite doing their utmost for all these years, they have not obtained the name of one single person. No one saw anything, no one did anything. And for so many decades, they have not been able to pin down who the guilty ones were. And when she saw I was liberated in Neustadt, she wanted to speak to me just in case I could add anything to their knowledge, to what happened. Unfortunately, I couldn't because we were on another barge, and we were probably protected by the fact that we were marched into Neustadt still under SS guard. And once they saw a group of us under SS guard, they left us alone. Had we made our own way into Neustadt, who knows, we might have had the same fate as this unfortunate group of people had. So this illustrates to you that there are dedicated Germans around who are, ashamed is the wrong word, but that they cannot do enough penance to compensate for the crimes committed by their parents, grandparents, etc. So there are a different generation of Germans around, but I'm afraid that people's memory is very short. You can see in Germany the extreme right-wing parties making gains, and I think many of the so-called asylum seekers who've been given refuge are also stirring up anti-Semitism. So the prospects are not so good.
If we can just share a few more points, and then we'll ask some other questions. But you continued going to school in Kassel, didn't you, till to the end of 1940? You carried on going to your... No. Soon after Kristallnacht, I went to the only Jewish school. There was a Jewish primary school in Kassel, which I attended. That was the only place where the German and Polish communities mixed. All Jewish children were accepted by that school. And shortly after Kristallnacht, the Germans issued an edict
forcing the school to close, and any Jewish children who attended non-Jewish schools were expelled from school. So there was no education for any Jewish children after that.
And how long did you stay in Kassel?
We stayed in Kassel in our own apartment. Some Jews were expelled from their apartments and had to move into what they called Jew houses. But we were left for some reason in peace. We could stay in our apartment until December 1941. That's when we were deported to Riga in Poland.
I'll just mention quickly one of the episodes that you shared with me, also about Kristallnacht, was how they came into your apartment, didn't they? But
not on Kristallnacht, no.
The next.
They came to look for my father to take him away, but that was not on Kristallnacht. That was a couple of days after.
Right.
Apparently, they'd set themselves a target to arrest 30,000 Jewish men.
Right.
And that they kept on rounding up men. Once they'd reached 30,000, apparently that was the end of their effort. Soon after, it was safe for my father to return because they were not arresting anymore.
So let's go back to where we were at the end of December 1941. Who were you with? Your mother and a brother?
My mother and a younger brother.
Right.
My father had been threatened with concentration camp after Kristallnacht. In mid-1939, my father was arrested and the Germans, the Nazis, were deporting him to Poland. The Poles refused to accept him, and as a result, he was scheduled to be sent he was kept in custody and scheduled to be sent to a concentration camp. My mother quite bravely made contact with the authorities holding him and pleaded for his release. And she was told that the only way he might be released is if he showed an exit visa, a visa permitting him entry to another country. But of course, every Jew in Germany wanted visas and there weren't any to be had. She made many unsuccessful attempts. And eventually, I think she must have heard something on the grapevine. She made her way to Berlin and applied for a visa at the British consulate in Berlin. And the Almighty decreed that she spoke to the British passport officer, the chief passport officer in person, whose name was Frank Foley. And if you want to see a heartwarming story, I'm not sure whether you know anything about him, go online with the name Frank Foley. This gentleman was a spy working for MI6. And this position of passport officer was a cover for his spying activities. But what none of the authorities realized that he was a man with a heart. And when he had queues of Jews lining up, pleading for a visa and telling him their heartbreaking stories, he couldn't resist. He issued many, many visas. In fact, I heard an academic speaking about him who said he had established that he saved more than 10,000 Jews pre-war. Actually taking chances. He had diplomatic immunity. And when he heard of a particularly sad case, when the husband was already sent to a concentration camp, he would enter the concentration camp and hand the visa directly to the person concerned, who would then be allowed out.
And so, thank God your father managed to get to England.
So she only received not only a visa, but also a promise that within a matter of a few weeks, we, the family, would receive visas to follow him. And the Nazis insisted that my father had to leave Germany within 24 hours. And unfortunately, 2 weeks after he left, the war began, and we, the family, were now trapped in Germany.
So you were in Germany until the end of 1941.
Correct.
What was life like for a young Jewish boy of 10, 11 years old in Nazi Germany till the end of 1941. What was life like?
Well, as you know, there was no schooling. My mother, Olea Sholem, attempted some sort of home tuition, but she was not a professional teacher. But she did her best. We were not permitted to enter any non-Jewish shop. There was just one shop which was designated as the Jewish shop. And whatever that shop didn't stock, we had to do without. And frequently, there was not sufficient food for all the community. Every single person living in Kassel had to buy from that shop. And to give you an indication of how desperate our position at times was, I remember clearly my mother taking me to a corner, standing on the opposite pavement to a non-Jewish baker's shop, which we were not allowed to enter. By that time, we were already wearing yellow stars. And he took my school satchel with me. She asked me to hold it in a way to cover my yellow star. She gave me some coins to hold, and we rehearsed several times that we would watch the shop when it was empty. I would run across into the shop, ask for a large bread, put the coins on the counter, and quickly run out again. And when I assured my mother that I was clear in what I had to do, she stood there watching me run into the shop, doing exactly as we had rehearsed, and I came out with a loaf of bread. I mean, at the time I was a little boy, I did as mother told me, but on reflection, in later years, I realized that no Jewish mother would risk her child's life in that manner unless she was pretty desperate. I guess that my mother would have been prepared to go hungry, but she couldn't see her children go hungry, and that is why we took this chance.
And the end of December 1941, what happened to your family?
It wasn't at the end. I remember the date actually, 12th of December. Again, there was a knock on our apartment. Two of those brown-shirted military men turned up, told my mother she had 10 minutes to pack a suitcase, and then we had to accompany them. They walked us to the local railway station, where we met a crowd of other Jews already assembled. Eventually, it swelled to around 1,000 people. We were packed into a train, and the train began moving. We had no idea where they were taking us. We traveled for 3 days and 3 nights. The train stopped. We were ordered out. We'd presumably gone east, because when we left the train, there was heavy snow and ice on the ground. And as we left the train, we realized we were surrounded by armed guards who formed us into a long column, and they walked us into the town of Riga, where we were housed in a ghetto, so a barbed wire surrounded area, part of Riga. The sort of old poor section of Riga had been turned into a ghetto. And that is where we spent a good 1.5 years.
What were conditions like in the Riga ghetto?
Well, we were immediately put on a starvation diet the moment we arrived. Every morning we had to line up on a sort of, in German we called it Appell, so it was an assembly. And there was an SS man who stood in groups. An SS man who had a list would shout out not names, but numbers. On the first morning there, as we assembled, this SS man told us, from now on, you do not have any names. Each one of you will have a number, and you'd better remember it, because forgetting it will result in punishment. And I remember desperately trying to memorize my number because there really was punishment, because this SS officer had next to him someone, a Jewish inmate called a trustee, who was holding a whip. And if you forgot your number or confused it, didn't say it properly, hesitated too long, not every time, but when he fancied, he would call you forward and you received some lashes from the whip as a punishment for not remembering. And
what was your number?
46578.
Tell me, I want to ask you a question as well. You know, you mentioned starvation, hunger, and I know that later on things got worse and worse.
Indeed.
What we don't understand what starvation means, what hunger means. Maybe can you share that with us, and also maybe share with the younger generation how do you keep going when things are so difficult, when one is hungry, when one has lost so much and there's no hope? So what does it mean to be hungry? And do people share with one another? And how do you keep going under such circumstances?
No, people did not share. In fact, unfortunately, if you didn't take good care or ate as fast as you could, there was a distinct risk that you would lose it by someone snatching it from you. You certainly couldn't sort of put any food aside for later, because that was a distinct risk that it would be taken from you. But the feeling of hunger becomes overpowering. Whatever else happens, you cannot forget that your tummy wants, and I say wants, it really makes itself felt. It needs something. It's empty, and you have to put something into your tummy. But of course, we couldn't give way to this. We had to obey orders, be obedient, work to their satisfaction. In the first camp, people under 13 were not required to work. In the Riga ghetto, that was the only camp where children under 13 were excused from work. My mother had to go out to work daily, and I had to look after my 7-year-old brother. I was 11, and I had to take care of my 7-year-old brother. Of course, he was also hungry, and both of us wanted food. And no, we didn't have any. And of course, in order to make things worse, one of the edicts the Germans issued is that people who go to work, like my mother, were forbidden on pain of death to bring any food into the camp when they returned from day's work. And adults like my mother, who had children to look after, were sorely tempted to do so. Many of them gave away articles of value to barter for a chunk of bread or butter or whatever they could get hold of. And on returning from the day's work, the Nazis would periodically take people out at random to body search. And it was actually on one such occasion, my little brother and I used to run to the entry gate to the camp to await my mother's return. And we often got there early, and we saw earlier groups returning. And on one such occasion, while we stood there waiting, from an earlier group, they took 2 people to body search, and they found some hidden food on a woman. And in full view of everyone, they took her aside, lined her up against the wall, and shot her, just to terrorize everyone into obeying their orders. And that was the first violent death I witnessed.
Let me ask you, if I understand, you were still in the ghetto in Riga when you turned 13. your bar mitzvah.
Yes.
This year has been a year where many boys and girls aged 12, 13 have not been able to have their bar mitzvah. Your father isn't with you. You're starving in the ghetto in Riga. People are being tortured and beaten and killed around you. Did you have a bar mitzvah? What happened to your bar mitzvah, your birthday?
I'll tell you briefly what happened. Among the group deported from Kassel, the group of 1,000, there was one teacher who used to teach me in that Jewish primary school. His name was Herr Bacher. And I told you when my mother, Olea Sholem, had to go to work, I had to look after my little brother. And that applied to every child. Now, this teacher, Mr. Bacher, was a remarkably dedicated and caring person. And he approached the leadership of the ghetto, that the Nazis appointed sort of a committee to run the camp internally. The leaders of this committee were also camp inmates. They had no real power, but the Germans passed on their orders through this committee, and they had a very limited authority within the camp. And he applied to them to be given the use of one room to care for the children from the Kassel transport. And after a while, apparently they offered him one room. And then all the children, which included my brother and me, were asked each morning to come into this room. And initially, Herr Bacher divided us into a few groups. And he began teaching one group at a time, just from things from his head. He had no facilities, no blackboards, no textbooks, nothing of that sort. He could just speak to them, tell us stories, or we could do simple mathematical terms and so on. But it didn't work, because when he taught the older groups, the younger ones got out of control, and it was pretty useless. So being a resourceful and very able person, he formed us into a choir. Now, a choir, regardless of age, from the little ones, 4 years old, to 12 years. Once you were 13, you had to go to work. So 4 to 12, all of us were turned into one choir, and he began teaching us Hebrew melodies, mainly taken from our prayers, like Adon Olam, Yigdal, Matovu. And even now, on a Yom Tov, when we sing these Nigunim in Shul, it brings back visions of how I learned these melodies. So that's what he did with us. And one day, he came up to me and he said, "Manfred, you've passed your 12th birthday. I know your father is not with you. Would you like me to teach you your bar mitzvah?" I had no idea what he was talking about, because I'd had no education for years. I didn't know anything about bar mitzvah, but I'm sort of inherently good-natured, and I think I must have been even as a youngster. So, and I respected him, and I said, "Yes, please, Herr Bacher." And he said, "Okay." And he began teaching. He had to calculate in his mind what he thought my bar mitzvah Shabbos should be. Incidentally, just a couple of Shabbos ago, Parshas Tzav, that was the bar mitzvah parsha he taught me. And extraordinarily, I remember in the camp in 1943, my bar mitzvah Shabbos was on the 27th of March, Parshas Tzav. And he also thought it was Shabbos Para. So he taught me the extra laning from Chukas, and he taught me the Haftarah from Parshas Porah. And 2 weeks ago, Shabbos HaGodol was Parshas Tzav, and it was again on the 27th of March. So to the day, it was 78 years.
So, Mr. Goldberg, what would you say to encourage a parent of a bar or bat mitzvah boy who missed out their bar mitzvah this year, or to a boy of 13 who didn't have a bar mitzvah, the way they imagined this year? What does Mr. Goldberg, who had his bar mitzvah, with Mr. Bacher in the Riga ghetto, what would you say to them?
Well, you don't know what you're missing. This bar mitzvah of mine, 78 years ago, in those surroundings, is an unforgettable event. It has remained clear in my mind year after year after year after year. Things may fade, but that experience was really something quite dramatic. It was out of my depth. I didn't understand the dedication and the significance of the transition from boyhood to manhood. I remember how proud I felt when I was told at that one and only minyan during almost 4 years in the camps, I never, either before or after, attended a single prayer service apart from that one Shabbat of my bar mitzvah. And that was entirely at the initiative of that dedicated teacher. I don't know how he managed it, because everyone had to go out to work, and he managed 10 people together.
Teachers and parents have had a tough time this year. What would you say to a teacher watching this? We have people from all over the world watching, talking to a 92-year-old survivor who had his bar mitzvah in the ghetto in Riga, in Latvia, and one Mr. Bacher changed your life by showing you what you could do and what could be. What would you say? What makes a good teacher? What encouragement do you have for teachers, for parents? What's the most important thing? You were separated from your family, separated from school. Somehow, without that schooling, when you got to England, I understand within 4 years you got a degree in electronics in University College London. So what is it that your parents and maybe Mr. Bacher showed you as teachers and parents that brought you through this very difficult time and kept you going then and afterwards?
Bacher wasn't able to teach me about Jewish practices. This was a one-off experience. I didn't have tefillin to put on, although I had a bar mitzvah. There was no siddur, no tefillin. I was not a practicing Jew. I had to get up every morning to work. I remember the very first time I spoke publicly in our synagogue, when it came to question time, a young man, probably a yeshiva bocher, raised his hand and said, "Excuse me, what did you do on Shabbos?" I said, "Shabbos? We didn't know what Shabbos was. We had to work 7 days a week." We just couldn't grasp it. It's difficult. So for me, Shabbos was non-existent. I didn't know when Pesach was. I have sort of read occasional stories of people saying that they managed to obtain flour and baked matzahs in the camps. This was something unheard of. Nothing like that happened in any of the 5 camps which I attended. On the contrary, in one of the camps, driven by hunger, when people were told that the trains passing through a busy junction on which we worked, and sometimes the train stopped for the green light to come, a group of men managed to break the seal on a wagon and stole some food. And this was an act of desperation. The Nazis came into the camp, took away 8 men, and one day we all had to assemble and watch these 8 men being hanged in retaliation. That was the price people had to pay. And these were innocent people that were taken away as hostages, not because they had stolen. It was not possible to establish who had stolen the food. But that was life then.
Mr. Goldberg, let me put the question a little bit differently, because somebody is asking me, one of our viewers is asking me the question to ask you, and I'll put it in the context of what we're talking about now. You know, you didn't have any religion during this time.
No.
You had, you know, one time you had a sort of a bar mitzvah of some sort. Your father wasn't with you, your teachers weren't, etc., etc. So why during this time and afterwards, why didn't you give up? I can see you're a religious man.
Yeah.
Why didn't you give up religion?
Okay, I'll tell you. And I'll be absolutely truthful with you. When we finally, months after our liberation, managed to make contact with my father in London, he was not permitted to come to see us. We couldn't speak by telephone, but he was allowed to write to us, and he was permitted to send us parcels. The first parcel he sent contained a pair of tefillin and a siddur for me. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to daven, really. Apart from that one experience, the 1 million, and as a little boy going to shul on weekdays, of course, I didn't go to shul with my father, but on Shabbos morning, I remember going to shul with him. But that was only when I was 6, 7, 8 years old. Then my father went off, and there was nothing more for me. So then I came to England, finally, age 16. My educational age, and that certainly included my Jewish knowledge, was that of an 80-year-old, and not that of an 80-year-old who goes to a Jewish school here where they have a really Jewish education. Our primary school in Kassel was really sort of a non-Jewish state school which taught the curriculum and just perhaps learning how to write the Aleph Beis and maybe to say Shema thrown in, but no proper Jewish learning like in today's Jewish schools. So my Jewish knowledge was almost zero. When I came to England, I didn't speak any English. We lived in Stamford Hill. There was a Jewish school nearby called the Avigdor School in Stoke Newington, and they ran an English crash course for refugees. I was too old to attend the school, although I had missed 7 years of schooling. I applied to attend the course that was not really part of the school, but they ran it. I was interviewed by Rebbetzin Grunfeld. Her husband was Diane Grunfeld, and there were 2 headmasters, she was a headmistress, and a headmaster, Dr. Levine. The 2 of them interviewed me, and during the interview, they sort of found out my background. And of course, they accepted me. I attended the English course, and I learned English very quickly. Now, what these 2 people did was something quite extraordinary. They didn't speak to me about it, but they contacted 2 members of the staff. One was a Rebbe, a Rav, and the second one was a secular teacher. The secular teacher was a Mr. Rosenthal, I remember, and the Rav, the rabbi, was Rabbi Yisrael HaKohen Halevi. He later became headmaster of Menorah Primary School, and he lived just around the corner from us, no more than 3-4 minutes away from me. And these two gentlemen contacted me and said that they would like to arrange for me to spend some time with them. And every Shabbat afternoon, I would walk around to Rabbi Cohen, and he would spend an hour or two with me, instilling some Jewish knowledge, very basic Jewish knowledge, which normally 8, 9-year-olds would learn. And I was 16 at the time. And that was how I slowly but surely gained some knowledge. Of course, my father always had also attempted. We opened a siddur between us, the two, and my father showed me the various tefillahs, the various prayers, and tried to explain to me just what we were doing, and when to stand, when to bow. And I would go to shul with him on Friday night and Shabbat morning. He expected me to wear a kippah, as he did. And I did all this, but it really didn't mean very much to me, I must tell you honestly, because of my lack of background. And then once I began to understand what we are saying in our prayers to the Almighty, it was clear to me that we think of the Almighty as a just and merciful God. And I could not accept that the God who allowed these things to happen to me could be a just and merciful God. So it was a bit hypocritical. And I couldn't bring myself to break particularly my father's heart. So outwardly, I remained a practicing, perhaps not exactly devout, but certainly practicing Jew. I would go to shul with him, I would begin to put on tefillin, I would pray. But there was this conflict within me. I just could not accept that the God I was praying to was merciful or even righteous. But slowly but surely, I began to mature. It was really the first time I began to live when I came here, age 16. The years prior to that were not really what we would call the normal life of a young Jewish boy. And I began to think for myself, and as I looked around, it began to dawn on me that this world we live in had to be guided. It's not a random creation. I began to sort of ponder on the miracles of the human body. So if we eat food that gives us energy, we manage to excrete what we don't want or don't need. What makes us think? What makes us breathe? I've been breathing for 90 plus years without any effort. Had it been up to me to think of it, I'm sure I would have forgotten long ago. So all in all, I looked at the sky on a nice bright evening. You see numerous stars in the sky. I began to read that the distance of the sun from the earth is some unimaginable figure, but had it been any bigger than that, the world would be too cold for us to live in. Had it been any less, we would be frying down here. So it began to become clear to me that there had to be an almighty creator who not only created the world, but also guided it. All this was private within me. I did not discuss it with my parents. This was turmoil in my mind. But eventually it became clear to me that, like it or not, there is a God who is in charge of the world and in charge of each one of us. And then something clicked within me, and it removed that internal turmoil. And both from reading our prayers and thinking about it, I said to myself that this God who is in charge of the world is self-evidently some superhuman, infinite being. And we are obviously finite people. We are born into this world, and after our 70, 80 years, or whatever he grants us, we have done our work here and we disappear. We go back into the ground. So we are finite beings. And if we, try as we want, cannot comprehend how this conflict is possible, it must be because the Almighty God does not wish us to understand. Initially, it didn't make too much sense to me, but with the help of Rabbi Cohen, as I went through the Chumash, I came across the episode where Moses pleads with the Almighty for the Almighty to give him some insight into the ways of God. And God's response is, no, my ways are not your ways. And that phrase has stuck with me. And it became clear to me that God's ways are not our ways, and therefore our minds are just, that it's beyond the limit of understanding of our minds.
So I'm Mr. Goldberg. The truth is, I and I think many of us watching could spend hours discussing this with you, and I must, I feel very small listening to somebody with a big black, yarmulke on his head and a devoutly Orthodox person speaking with such humility and integrity. It really is very humbling, and I thank you for sharing that. And maybe we'll get an opportunity to continue the discussion. If we could just wrap up, I'll ask you, can you just wrap things up and give maybe what is the message of a survivor such as yourself? What is your message for your grandchildren?
Well, thank God we have a good number. Each one of them is precious to us. Since we have so little family, this family of ours is extra precious. As well as friends to us are more precious than material possessions. But to our grandchildren, I would just say, thank God, all our children, all 4 of them, and their families, have all followed the righteous path, which I hope my wife and I showed them. We didn't just tell them, this is what you do. We showed them by doing ourselves, because children don't do what you tell them to do. They do what they see others do. And they tend to follow that. If they realize their parents are not just saying it, but believing and practicing it, it's easier for them to accept and understand. And my message is that your parents are righteous, generous people who are models for our community. Please follow in their footsteps, and you'd be a credit not only to your families. I know it's a hackneyed phrase when we say, and to Klal Yisrael, but I do mean it.
Thank you very much.
Every Jew has a responsibility towards all Jews, I feel.
Thank you so much. Really, we appreciate you spending time. I know it's late at night, and you should be blessed with happy birthday for the 21st.
Thank you.
And I can tell you I know your children, and they really are paragons of goodness and decency and examples in the community for everybody to follow. So for somebody who didn't have an education and who endured such hardship, your resilience is incredible, and your positivity. And thank you so much for spending time with us. Very much appreciated. And and good night. And to all of you who are with us with this JRoots program for Yom HaShoah, it continues tomorrow. If you look at the website, the JRoots website, or the Facebook, there's a full program tomorrow
Yes.
as well. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Mr. Goldberg.
I have looked through the program. Yes, I do intend participating in some of the events. And I thank you for the opportunity you've given me of
Thank you.
sharing these memories with you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.